Okay, great gowns, beautiful gowns.
I never thought this day would come. Let me explain. As the esteemed video essayist and cultural analyst that I am known to be, I try my best to consume media with an open mind and reflect on it in a nuanced manner. It's not my place to declare that anything is undeniably good or bad. In theory, I find this kind of thinking to be the enemy of any productive critical analysis. But as you may have noticed, I am a human girl, and such strong, blinding opinions as these befall the best of us. So sometimes I do decide whether or not I'll like something before I even watch it. There are some actors or directors whose work I will enjoy regardless of its quality, and there are some actors or directors who, for whatever reason, I have decided I simply do not like. Emerald Fennell is one of them. It is with a slightly heavy heart that I criticize. I really try to ride for women directors, and I think it's awesome that all her feature films have garnered such widespread mainstream attention. And for what it's worth, I'm an equal opportunity hater. There are plenty of working male directors who are not safe for me, but that's simply for another video. Despite any respect I may have for her success, Fennell's work prior to this year has failed to impress me and honestly actively bothered me. Promising Young Woman launched into immediate action from the Me Too torn film industry, but it fell short with an ending that, upon thinking about it deeper for more than a few seconds, is quite upsetting and strangely in favor of law enforcement no matter how you look at it. And then there was Saltburn. Girl, I was not a fan.
It's lucky for you, I'm a vampire.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
With its lavish candy-colored shots tailor-made to go crazy on Tumblr and Pinterest, and its crazy pure shock value scenes dead set on going viral on Twitter and TikTok, I felt Saltburn was an obviously manufactured cultural moment, but a lackluster film. So when it was announced that Fennell was back for another round, this time with an adaptation of Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, with a mid-30s Margot Robbie as the teenage Kathy and white boy of many months Jacob Elordi as Heathcliff, described in the novel as racially ambiguous and having dark skin, as well as the soundtrack by Charlie XCX and Fennell's clear attempt at being hip with the kids, I couldn't help but roll my eyes along with seemingly everyone else. I continue to do so as more promotional materials for the film rolled out, including the trailer in which Margot Catherine dons tinted sunglasses and gets laced into a corset over her bare back, very 1700s. And when this image came out of Margot in what looked like a discarded Barbie costume, I started to suspect that surely all of this ridiculousness had to be intentional. Others online seem to speculate what the movie actually was as well, noting the quotations around the title and coming up with the theory that the movie would actually embody the "it was all a dream" cliche in which Margot played not Catherine, but a woman who read Bronte's novel and envisioned herself as Catherine. And yet this possible explanation still didn't satisfy me or ease my curiosity, and I worried viewers would fall down the same trap as the followers of the infamous Stranger Things conformity gate, crafting an elaborate theory and then being disappointed when that theory of their own creation didn't somehow come true. Anyways, then I came across this interview with Fennell in which she was asked to explain those peculiar quotation marks around the title.
The thing for me is that you can't adapt a book as dense and complicated and difficult as this book. I can't say I'm making Wuthering Heights. It's not possible. What I can say is I'm making a version of it. There's a version that I remembered reading that isn't quite real. And there's a version that I wanted stuff to happen that never happened. And so it is Wuthering Heights and it isn't. But really I'd say that any adaptation of a novel, especially a novel like this, should have, quotation marks around it.
And suddenly it all kind of clicked for me. Though I still had my hesitations, I was really struck with her way of approaching adaptations. Which brings us to the note I started this video on, the day I never could have foreseen. Am I about to defend an Emerald Fennell film? Well, only kind of. After all this confused anticipation, I saw the film. Unfortunately, but unsurprisingly to myself, I did not like it. But seeing the discourse surrounding the film online, I'm realizing that I also dislike the reasons other people are disliking the film, with this strict, heavy focus on the film's faithfulness to the book, despite Fennell's attempted explanations of her point of view. Here's the thing, whether or not this film is accurate to its source material is honestly the least interesting point of discussion to me, and quite frankly, the least of the film's problems. Using the story of Wuthering Heights as a kind of vessel more than a blueprint, Fennell attempts to transform the vengeful ghost story into a horny love story with vague 2020s feminist ambitions. Attempts being the operative word here. To convey this, Fennell made several changes to Bronte's work, many of which I do agree ultimately altered the story for the worse. But I'm sure there are a ton of girlies online who have made line-by-line analyses of every change made from page to screen, and trust I will be watching those too. In this video, I'm not seeking to linger on the fact that changes were made. Instead, I want to investigate what those changes were trying to do and what the film ultimately ended up saying or failed to say about themes of sexuality, pleasure, shame, gendered power, and so on. Because if you've seen one of my videos before, you know that themes like these, oh, they are my bread and butter, my cup of tea, my jam, my speed, and right up my alley. And to do so, I think we can start with Fennell's own words on adaptations, that all adapted titles should be in quotes, as if to invoke the spirit of a text, not retell every word of it. What then is an adaptation? Okay, I think I kind of ate and I look cute. Okay, quick disclaimer too if anyone's heading to the comments after seeing that title card. Despite what I'm about to say about the artistic freedom in adapting another work, I do think there are some things that are non-negotiables and should not be changed. Obviously, the race and ethnicity of characters of color is one of those things, especially at the hands of a white filmmaker. In fact, the film's characterization of race is actually a major part of my critique of it, which I'll get into in a later section of this video. Additionally, if Wuthering Heights is near and dear to your heart, then of course it's okay to feel some type of way about this film. Admittedly, it's not my classic of choice. If there was some modern retelling of Dorian Gray in the works, then maybe I'd be singing a different tune myself. And anyways, it's been a good few years since I read Wuthering Heights, so do forgive me for some gaps in memory. But I want to gently encourage us all to expand our thinking a little bit when it comes to the possibilities of adaptations in filmmaking as an art form. So let's get into these possibilities. In my research for this video, and maybe this is only super interesting to me, I found that these discussions of faithfulness in book-to-screen adaptations have been ongoing since such adaptations began decades ago. So much so that adaptation studies are a small subsect of media studies and theory. And according to those in the field, fidelity criticism, or a measure of how accurate a film is to its source material, is not and should not be the only way of reading an adaptation. As read on literarylatitude.com, while fidelity criticism can be useful in identifying the changes made during adaptation, it often suffers from a hierarchical view that privileges the source text over the film. One paradigm within fidelity criticism is the translation model, which views the novel as the superior art form and expects the film to serve its literary precursor. This model prioritizes traditionally literary elements while minimizing specifically cinematic elements. And I think on social media platforms like TikTok and Twitter, where much of discourse and discussion is based upon positioning yourself in intellectual, aesthetic, or otherwise moral superiority to those you disagree with, this, well, have you read the book argument is amplified even more so. And yes, literacy rates are a problem, everyone should be reading more, blah, 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 but everyone should be watching more films too. Films are not a lower form of art or intellectualism than novels. They simply are different mediums and have very different conventions. These technical differences between the two are pretty straightforward. For instance, novels tell. They have more freedom to give us access to characters' inner workings, whereas effective films show these inner thoughts, motives, and subtext through the medium's visual conventions. And on visualization, the images conjured by books are entirely subjective and dependent on the reader's mind. Though films are of course still open to audience interpretation, the images each viewer sees are always the same. Books and movies are different machines, they have different rules, you get the idea. But more importantly than differences in artistic conventions, films hold important intellectual and cultural value which should not be diminished by this argument which implies that a novel is inherently the more distinguished way to deliver a story. Even when not explicitly political, films are revelatory barometers of the time and place in which they were made, regardless of if the film takes place in a different time period or is based on something written in the past. I fully expect a film released in 2026 and based on a novel published in 1847 to be more telling of 2026 culture than of 1847 culture. And if I may take us on a quick tangent for a moment, there's just something I watched for the first time recently that really feels like it rewired my brain and made me rethink what a film's relationship to its source material can be. This film was Todd Haynes' Velvet Goldmine. It is not based on a book, but rather takes blatantly obvious inspiration from the life of a culturally significant musician, David Bowie. But it's not a biopic, which lately seems to be the only option for making a film about an artist. It's a film made in the 90s about a character in the 80s, reflecting on the 70s, specifically the impact a figure like Bowie had on a young queer man, amidst a time of massive global cultural change. Mention of the name Todd Haynes might bring to mind his most recent film, May December.
I don't think we have enough hot dogs.
Which really emphasized the way his dry sarcasm and expository point of view are at odds with the morality-centered way we assess media online in the Letterboxd/film Twitter age. If released today, Velvet Goldmine would be received no differently. It was made while Bowie was still alive, and the character modeled after him, Brian Slade, is not always depicted very favorably, a contrast to biopics of today which practically deify their famous subjects. Both within the film and in its greater meta-narrative, Velvet Goldmine seems to point out the flaws of the nature of adaptation, as Bale's character grapples with the memory of something versus the reality of his present moment. Some words from Haynes himself might be illuminating for us here. When interviewed on Velvet Goldmine, he spoke on his intention to create strong senses of worlds being foreclosed and not fully accessible to us today. And that's often where all the yearning or desire for them is summoned. And maybe this statement in itself is the true nature of adaptations and their relation to their source material, a yearning for the moment of first experiencing something that can never fully be recreated. Many adaptation studies experts contend with this as well, finding that the promise of an adaptation rests on nostalgia, the satisfaction of something already known and familiar. Maybe the goal of a truly accurate adaptation is an impossible one, as consuming a piece of art/media is an experience, one that cannot be fully transferred onto another work. So the secondary work gets to be experienced as its own thing. A movie based on something, be it a book or play or historical figure, etc., is not that thing. Forgive me for sounding harsh, but if you want the exact story and experience of a book, the only way you're going to get that is by reading the book. Instead, I found that an adaptation film can be read in numerous different ways, beyond just fidelity to the source material. Adaptations can be interpreted as intertextual, or combining elements of a source text as well as other texts, events, etc. to produce a broader cultural discussion on a topic. I think Greta Gerwig's Little Women is a good example of this, in which Gerwig combined elements of author Louisa May Alcott's other works and wrote in a modern perspective on 19th century gender roles. Or we could read adaptations as the director's interpretation of a source material, in which a director's voice is present alongside the author's. They make deliberate choices to deliver the story with a specific tone and vision in mind. Think of Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein. Watch my other video on this, hint hint. Del Toro has the utmost respect for Shelley's novel, even going so far as to have the film's title written in her handwriting on the poster, yet he infuses his own trademark visual style and quirks. Or we can view some adaptations as rewriting the work completely, perhaps plucking out the characters and plot points and dropping them in a different time and place. Remember that films like 10 Things I Hate About You and Clueless are adaptations of Shakespeare and Jane Austen, set within these social spheres of American high schools in the 90s. These movies are far beyond what the original authors could have possibly conceived of, but that doesn't make them invalid adaptations. Looking beyond the mere level of fidelity to the novel, I think Fennell's Wuthering Heights is suspended awkwardly between these latter two readings. As an interpretation, her own personal reading and recollection of Bronte's novel, and as rewriting, an attempt to present the basic foundation of the story within a new context. So what exactly did Fennell interpret and rewrite the story as? I think it would be helpful to break down the answer to this question in 3 steps: vision, execution, and impact. I'll observe the overall effect of the narrative changes, additions, and cuts she made to the story, her specific tonal and aesthetic choices, and of course, the casting elephant in the room, and what message the film ultimately sent, if any. So let's get into it. Hi, this is editing me here. I just wanted to say, going into these sections where I talk about the actual film, it was very hard for me to find a lot of high quality clips of it, with the film being so new, of course. So enjoy extra long sections of just me talking. Thank you very much. And also, mid-video reminder to hear me out and be nice in the comments. Thank you. Obviously, some spoilers for Wuthering Heights are ahead, so if you still want to watch the film spoiler-free, first of all, what are you doing here, girl? But second, I will sadly suggest that you click off. But please come back after you see the movie, please. I'll miss you. This version of Wuthering Heights begins with noises over black. Noises of grunting and groaning, which, given the salacious marketing of the film, we presume to be sexual, until we see that these are the grunts of a man being publicly hanged, or hung. And then we see that through his cloak, this man has an erection. Upon taking in this startling beginning, I realized that the film wanted to be read as camp, a term which has recently entered mainstream consciousness following the 2019 Met Gala. Simply put, camp thrives on artifice and theatricality. It's a bit harder to define in words than to simply see and recognize, but I've once heard camp described as that on purpose. Think of The Substance, when we learn that the protagonist's name is Elizabeth Sparkle and she gets swiftly fired from her job the day she turns 50. When we see the ginormous fateful billboard right outside her penthouse window, we know we are in a heightened, intentionally ridiculous version of reality. The sheer audacity of Wuthering Heights' opening sought to have this sort of effect. With its disturbing visual and oral representations of sex, death, and public shame, it seemed to clue the audience into the 2+ hours to follow and send a very clear message. Nothing here is going to be subtle, and everything will be sexual. This lack of subtlety is a constant throughout the film, with sudden disquieting images and sounds a la this hanging scene continuing, such as a cut to a close-up on a slug's slimy trail signifying you-know-what, or the sound of cracking of eggs as a kind of foreplay. These idiosyncratic appeals to the senses bring this kind of camp to the film's sexual ambitions as well. In an interview with Letterboxd, Fennell shares the following on this overwhelming sense of desire she sought to weave throughout the film. It's about when your senses are alive, when you're in that space of complete and utter debilitating desire, whether it's the skin of a pig's trotter, things that should not be arousing, everything becomes completely undoing. It's always about that for me. It's everything. It's not interesting, just two bodies. That's not the thing that gets us. It's the little surprising things, the little disturbing things, the little moments of intimacy that make it all feel visceral. In this version, in which sex and romance take the front seat, Fennell is unsubtle and unflinching in the way she strictly focuses on the relationship between Heathcliff and Catherine. Heathcliff and Catherine. In adapting the text, she makes many sacrifices, including cutting major characters such as Hindley Earnshaw, and adds many unconventional inclusions of her own. It's as if Fennell cut out the scenes from the book with the most romantic and sexual potential, put them together, and then took a magnifying glass to them, exaggerating them on every front. Rather than the unraveling story within a story structure from the novel, Fennell's version is much more streamlined, starting shortly after the execution scene, from the moment Catherine and Heathcliff first meet, and ending just as soon as one of them dies. All other characters and plot points exist here solely to serve this central romance. But again, given everything we just discussed in defense of the various forms adaptations can take, I don't think Fennell exactly intended to massacre Bronte's story and present an oversimplified, lazy version of it. She takes a rather unique personal perspective on the novel, infamously explaining, "I wanted to make something that made me feel like I felt when I first read it," which means that it's an emotional response to something. "I wanted to make something that was the book I experienced when I was 14. And honestly, this approach of conveying a teenage girl's misinterpretation of Wuthering Heights as a romance novel is very interesting to me. These girlish ambitions do come across throughout the film in its attempts at creating a campish aesthetic. And on aesthetic, the visual language of Fennell's film is perhaps where her vision of an emotional, fantastical version of the story takes form the most. As one watches the film, it becomes increasingly clear that Fennell's goal was not historical accuracy in the sets and costuming, by any means. The film is intentionally anachronistic, meaning historically out of place. These anachronisms function first to convey melodramatic emotions and themes in a campy, on-the-nose way, and second to further emphasize that this is not the period piece we were expecting to see. In going so far to shirk all expectations, Fennell's vision is inherently polarizing. As I said, I myself had a lot of hesitation going into this movie, particularly for all the strange choices that seemed to be going on. But as I watched it with the context of Fennell's perspective in mind, the choices themselves seemed to feel a little less random to me. But don't be fooled, this is not to say that every flaw in this movie can be brushed off by saying it was supposed to be that way, it's supposed to be campy. And there are many flaws. Additionally, though I do understand what she was going for, that does not mean that I think these attempts were done well. At all. As a filmmaker, Fennell has the liberties, and she does have the means, to create the film she envisions. But for the viewer, did the colorful, erotic, romantic view of Wuthering Heights that existed in Fennell's mind come across clear enough to justify the alterations made to the novel? I guess it's quite fitting that I use the term execution for this section, because we're going to start again at the film's opening scene, a public execution first disguised as sex. Unfortunately, I got a little too attached to the scene's promises of having any thematic relevance throughout the film. Yes, there is more sex, and yes, there is more death, but nary is there another interesting connection made between the two. Let me start by saying, though, that the visual styling of the film is not nothing. In fact, I actually love the film's mise-en-scène. Its production design was immersive and fantastical, with the interiors of Thrush Cross Grange, that's hard to say, being a highlight for me. The visual symbolism was so over the top and obvious, like hand sconces, a flesh wall, that it circled around to being the right amount of too much for me. And this might be an especially unpopular opinion, but I like the costumes in a similar way, except that damn pink dress that needs to be burned. As Catherine delved further into her wealthy lifestyle, which itself was filled with visual excess but devoid of purpose, her gowns became so historically wrong, so cartoonish, that the camp ideal of that on purpose was achieved. But here's the thing, costumes and sets can't be doing all the legwork. The script itself, the beats, the performances, the stakes, should all be on the same page, all pushing the same limits, or else accusations of style over substance, which haunted Fennell in the Saltburn days, are bound to come creeping back. Speaking of substance, let's look again at the inherent camp of the substance as an example. Even if you take away the stylistic elements like the pounding music, the disorienting fisheye lenses, the body horror, we are still left with a plot that is clear and rightfully ridiculous on its own. A woman turns 50 and takes a substance to become a younger version of herself. She is instantly treated differently on every front. She becomes addicted to it. This is a statement on beauty standards and the cultural disposability of women as they age. But if you take away the lavish sets and costumes of Wuthering Heights, Fennell's campy reimagining did not hold on its own, and it was unclear what it was actually trying to say. The most successfully campy moment to me was a small and morbid one. Catherine's father drinks himself to death, and when discovered, his body is surrounded by two comically large piles of comically large bright green liquor bottles. This actually got an audible chuckle out of me. And it felt like so many moments were so close to achieving this level of effectiveness, but just barely fell short in a way which has left me frustrated more than anything. Because of this, Wuthering Heights is not so recognizable as an exercise in camp. At the last second, it shies away from what it so desperately wants to do, and spends a whopping 2 hours and 17 minutes awkwardly doing so. And if camp isn't executed effectively enough to be read as that on purpose, it just reads as that on accident. And yet there are still more unfulfilled promises, more acts of just shying away from seeing something through to be discussed. The film's marketing promised a high-stakes, sweeping romance with pearl-clutching, toe-curling displays of sexual obsession, Wuthering Heights as you've never seen it before. On the romance side, there was a kind of general message of, well, love makes you do crazy things, as Catherine and Heathcliff's unattainable spiritual longing for one another drove them to harm themselves, each other, and those around them. This was all fine and gripping enough, but nothing beyond standard heterosexual fare, which I have seen many times before. But then there was the sex. And that's literally it. There was just some sex in it. It felt as if the film had some obligation to deliver sex for the sake of shock. Every time the two leads had sex, it felt like, hey, look over here, we're making Wuthering Heights with sex in it.
It insists upon itself, Lois.
The problem I'm trying to get at is it felt like Fennell thought that characters simply having sex was the most sexual, provocative thing you can do. And I know you're probably like, well, duh. But let me explain through yet another example. If you've been here since day one in my very first video essay, you may know that my favorite film is the 2002 movie Secretary, in which a troubled young woman finds relief through engaging in BDSM acts with her boss. And I know that sounds wrong and awful and weird, but I explain it there and that's not all too important here. In her aforementioned interview with Letterboxd, Fennell even invokes Secretary as an aspirational reference. In Secretary, the two leads don't have quote-unquote intercourse until the very end, and yet everything is sexual leading up to it. Rat traps, red Sharpies, orchids, and digging through the garbage take on undeniably erotic connotations. In the quote I shared earlier, Fennell even shares this everything can be sexual approach herself. It's the little surprising things, the little disturbing things, the little moments of intimacy that make it all feel visceral. And there are some sprinkles of this, like the snail trail or the eggshells, but the difference is, in Wuthering Heights, these symbols of sexuality are purely exclaimed to the audience, saying, hey, this is sexual, don't you get it? In Secretary, the sexual acts of not sex are played between the characters with a completely straight face, heightening the camp factor, but also deepening the intimacy between the two. Fennell's approach gets the concept of sex through to the audience, sure, but it does little to actually build and develop sexual tension when the characters are not just, boning. And yet, there was one bold exception to the film's otherwise underwhelming attempts at freakiness: Alison Oliver's standout performance as Isabella Linton. First of all, I felt that Oliver was one of the only cast members who really delivered a camp performance that fit the attempted tone of the film. But there's one scene in particular I'm bringing up here, and if you've seen the film, you already know. Of course, this is the scene in which Isabella, in her willing marriage to Heathcliff, despite her knowledge that he does not love her, submits to him to the point of being trained and leashed like a dog. This pretty clearly harkens to the BDSM dynamics of Secretary, and maybe I'm sick in the head, that's a conversation for me and my therapist, but this type of stuff is just so strangely riveting to me.
Love that kind of stuff.
And yes, I know this is a huge departure from Isabella's fate in the book, so I do understand discomforts in that regard. I'll dissect the implications of this deeper in my next and final section too. However, I simply think this sexual dynamic of Isabella willingly being with a man who loves someone else, so long as it means she can be with him anyways, and going so far as to submit to him in this way, is so much more interesting than whatever run-of-the-mill romance stuff Catherine and Heathcliff actually had going on, albeit quite disturbing. But I'd rather be disturbed than bored. However, the film barely scratched the surface of the intricate, nuanced potential of this Isabella-Heathcliff dynamic before wrapping up that storyline entirely. So, despite a massive marketing push for the film catered towards the freaky, weird girls of Gen Z, we got a few seconds of half-baked puppy play and some regular sex with two leads sticking each other's fingers in their mouths every once in a while. And listen, I don't mean to sound like some gross, horny gooner. I just mean in the sense that,
No.
you know what I mean? Like, if you're going to promise something so vastly different with a work so beloved by many, the least you can do is actually wholeheartedly deliver on your different choices, which make that leap all worth it. Instead, Fennell and her film took such a big swing, but shied away from what they were actually attempting to do. Across the board, Wuthering Heights was a case of a high risk, but low reward. We know now that this film was an unsuccessful attempt at retelling the classic story as one of romantic obsession and destruction through stylistic excess. But one question remains. Through all these missteps, what does this film actually end up saying about its subject matter? And taking into consideration particular points of controversy, what is ultimately being said about gender, class, and race? As mentioned earlier, the period-inaccurate costumes revealed in the trailer and promotional materials had many online theorizing that the film would actually be about a grown woman somehow ending up inside the book she was reading. Now, this didn't end up happening in the film, but it's not the film that Fennell ended up making. Listen, it goes without saying that Margot Robbie is a talented, versatile actress, but even after watching the film where she had some great moments, I never felt she was so right for the role. This was for many reasons, but one of them being that Kathy, even in Fennell's version, is supposed to be a teenager. And hey, I do not mean to be ageist. Robbie is in her 30s and that is not by any means old, but I bring this up very intentionally to point out the fact that Robbie is closer in age to Fennell than she is to the character herself. And sure, maybe they're just both white blonde ladies, but her and Fennell don't necessarily look dissimilar either. Taking all this into account, alongside Fennell's intention of creating the version of the story that exists to her, I couldn't help but view the film with a sort of self-insert narrative in mind. She is the one who woke up inside the story. Given the shallow ways class is discussed in the film and the way race is ignored, the film seems inseparable from Fennell's positioning as a white woman and, from what I see on social media all the time, one with an apparent wealthy upbringing. Which of course brings us to Fennell's consequential casting of Jacob Elordi as Heathcliff. Funnily enough, this is not even my first time talking at length about the significance of casting Elordi in a role. See my Frankenstein video.
I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice, right?
Like Robbie, Elordi is no doubt a great actor, and with his famous looks and heartthrob status, he usually would be a shoo-in for a romantic lead. But not this romantic lead. Though Heathcliff's racial identity is not specifically named in the novel, it is still made apparent that he is not white. This sheer fact positions him as one of the great examples of the literary other. He is inherently out of place in the society of the novel and, despite his best efforts, unable to successfully transcend the barriers of class. Fennell defends her choice of casting Elordi, once again maintaining that she was just trying to please the fantasies of her teen self and craft the version of the character that she pictured while reading it. But what can we make of the fact that her romantic ideal defaulted to white? And what about Heathcliff's role as an other? Without this rich subtext and with his more nefarious traits toned down for tortured romantic appeal, Heathcliff's biggest barrier to climbing the social ladder is, like, his beard. I kid a bit, but it is true that both Heathcliff and Catherine slip through rigid socioeconomic statuses with ease in this film. Much like what she was widely critiqued for in Saltburn, Fennell's stance on class here is a bit confusing and unclear. Surely some sort of statement is attempting to be made, since class is made important at all, and yet with such a loose and generalizing characterization of class disparity, it's clear both films themselves are made from a perspective of privilege. There also seems to be an inadvertent connection between status and the film's attempted promotion of female sexual empowerment. The only time in the film in which the execution from the opening scene is referenced is when, at a dinner table, characters mention to Kathy that another execution is in order, but this time a woman is to be hanged. For a brief moment, Kathy's face flashes with shame and guilt, perhaps wondering if acting upon sexual desire is enough to sentence one to death. But don't get too curious, because this very intriguing idea of Kathy's experiencing sexual shame is not overtly brought up again. At some point off screen, she must have contended with this, because from this point on, she becomes stone cold and relentless when it comes to attaining her sexual desires, enacting cruelty against Isabella and Nellie just to be with Heathcliff. Here the film finds itself in a kind of ideological trap. It attempts to show the complexities and negative traits of Catherine's character while also displaying these acts of cruelty as Catherine at her most empowered and in control of her sexual desires. It seems to Fennell that sexual empowerment is more so about having power over others, a rather girl boss take on the matter. And what of Isabella, who finds herself Heathcliff's willing dog? Are we supposed to read her as a victim or as sexually empowered? It's clear something secretary-esque was attempted here, this idea of submission as a choice, of the sub actually wielding the power. But due to the cultural taboo, dynamics of kink, domination, and submission are very delicate and often misunderstood. They are not something to just throw in once or twice to get some easy gaffes out of the audience without considering the implications. A narrative of power and submission, at the very least, requires a sense of autonomy. Because Isabella, like all the other characters, existed solely to serve the Kathy-Heathcliff relationship, she is not autonomous within the narrative. Her choices do not function to further her own development or storyline, and the main plot would continue on regardless of whether Isabella's submission was willing or not. Thus, Fennell's attempt at something daring and subversive is fundamentally faulty. Even worse, it seems as if Isabella's consent to submitting to Heathcliff also happened off-screen. In one scene she's hesitant, in the next she's smiling and winking from her leash. Without the necessary context and autonomy given to the character in the more vulnerable position, I see how this is being received in a very uncomfortable way, especially with traditional values of female subservience on the rise. And if we take into account my theory of a self-insert narrative, the fact that the more unconventional sexual acts fall onto a supporting character rather than the director's surrogate lead, there seems to be a slightly patronizing view here, as if to say, yes girl, good for her. Couldn't be me though. Further, reading the film as this embodiment of white womanhood and desire does not just stop at the casting of the leads. 2 actors of color are in the supporting cast, with Pakistani English actor Shahzad Latif as Edgar Linton and Vietnamese actress Hong Chow as Nellie. This excerpt from a New Yorker review of the film really well conveys some hesitations I had surrounding this colorblind casting. Fennell has been forced to defend herself for casting a white male lead, and it struck me that her deployment of 2 actors of color, Chow and Latif, in key supporting roles could have been a calculated kind of insurance against criticism, a way of still laying claim to a token measure of diversity. And I can't help but agree with this pessimistic view on the casting here, especially when the film's only woman of color is a servant to our white leads, and only man of color is romantically and sexually undesirable to the female lead in comparison to a hunky white man. However, another review, this one for Vulture, provides a more optimistic and subversive interpretation on this question of race in the film, suggesting space for an oppositional gaze through Chow's Nellie. The author writes, "It's Chow who, in a funny way, becomes an audience surrogate. In a movie that finds the idea of dying for love as romantic as living for it, she provides a necessary balance, not skeptical of the epic emotions that the lovers feel, but a wry reminder of how tiresome it would be to have to live with 2 people so convinced of their main character energy." Still, this reading seems to be in the hands of the viewer rather than something intended by the filmmaker, as the plot is so centered on Catherine and Heathcliff that other characters are not given enough space to truly have command of the cinematic gaze. This apparent lack of forethought put into all these racial implications posed by the film really alters the significance of one of the most vivid pieces of imagery from the film, Catherine's skin wall. When Catherine moves to Thrushcross Grange after marrying Edgar, he presents her with a bespoke bedroom, which features some interesting design choices. The walls are a specific shade of beige pink, and he says something along the lines of this color being that of Catherine's beautiful skin.
I said it should be the most beautiful color in the world. The color of my wife's sweet face. Here, look. The freckle from your cheek.
And I'll admit, I personally thought the skin wall was kind of cool in theory. It conveyed this idea of obsession and lust for flesh more than the actual plot delivered. It also kind of brought to mind a womb, foreshadowing Catherine's fate. But in a film where the whitewashing of one of its romantic leads has become a major point of conversation, in a film which cannot be separated from the political climate under which it was produced, I could not help but feel that a visual shrine to one's fair skin felt weird. Whether or not this was an intentional dog whistle of sorts, it certainly came across a weird choice with implications that were not adequately thought out. I don't know, you guys. I haven't really even seen this reading of the skin wall discussed too much online yet, so maybe I'm being the friend that's too woke, but as a multiracial person myself, the way that the themes of race from the novel were omitted, and yet racial difference was present in the movie but eerily glossed over, and then something like the skin wall happens, it just all gave a strange taste in my mouth. Across the board, it seems like Wuthering Heights failed to read the room in major ways. It was simply a menagerie of missteps and impulsive, shallow choices like these set to Charlie XCX music from the clear perspective of a woman actually out of touch with the young audience she so desperately craves the validation of. Sorry. But as I've expressed here, in order to reach these critiques, it's necessary to put our expectations from the book aside just a bit to fully see what's going on. So to sum up, do I think Fennell had to make the book as written? Not necessarily, but do I think what she attempted to do with her own artistic vision was actually effective, enjoyable, and worthwhile? Well,
I mean, let me ask the audience.
Okay, before I let you go, I thought I'd try out something a little different to wrap up this video. One of my life philosophies genuinely is that everyone should watch more films, so I usually leave some recommended viewing related to the topic in the description of my videos. But today I had the mind of a mastermind idea to include these recommendations in the video with a little blurb and elaboration. For this one, I wanted to base my recs around films that fulfilled the empty promises left by Fennell's movie. First, of course, there have been several other film adaptations of Bronte's novel. Unfortunately, I have not gotten around to watching any of them, but from my research, I am especially interested in Andrea Arnold's 2011 adaptation. She's a very cool, very gritty director, and this is so far the only adaptation to cast Heathcliff as a person of color. Frances O'Connor's Emily is also high up on my watch list, which is semi-fictional about Emily Bronte's life and her writing of Wuthering Heights. Now, what I have seen, if you like the anachronistic, semi-modern visual style of Wuthering Heights against a historical setting, but wanted it to go further as the freaky Gothic tale it was promoting itself to be, I recommend The Ugly Stepsister. This is an actually twisted take on a classic. As the title suggests, it's a retelling of Cinderella through the eyes of one of her stepsisters. It was one of my favorite films to come out last year. It's got a really satisfying blend of body horror with very feminine imagery and does a good job balancing shock and camp with very emotional, affecting feminist themes. But if you're not a fan of body horror or want something a little more understated, check out Sally Potter's Orlando from 1992. Tilda Swinton gives a very cool gender-bending performance as an English nobleman who lives from the 1600s to the 1990s, waking up as a woman along the way. It's a very subversive take on a period piece, and it's got some of the most beautiful costumes I've ever seen, oh my goodness. And this one's more of a deep cut, but if you like the intertwining story within a story format of Wuthering Heights the novel, I recommend the 1948 film Letter from an Unknown Woman. A man receives a love letter from an unknown woman who claims to know him and warns that she might be in danger. The story that the letter unfolds is one full of melodrama, betrayal, and gaggery all around. It provides a great critique of the cruelty of men that we don't expect from a film made in that time, and I don't know, I just think it fits right in here. Finally, I definitely recommend the 3 films I referenced throughout the video: Todd Haynes' Velvet Goldmine for a unique take on adaptation, Coralie Fargeau's The Substance for a masterclass in camp with purpose, and Steven Sheinberg's Secretary for the fun, freaky film Wuthering Heights promised but never delivered. Alright, I think I'm done talking about Wuthering Heights for the rest of the year now. Obviously, this film is sparking some very passionate, very spirited responses online, which again, I do understand. However, I know I took a bit of an unpopular opinion about adaptations and book accuracy here, so please, if you made it this far, take it easy on me. Anyways, I'm Liv. I make video essays about film, pop culture, and mostly the online discourse that happens about them. I try to post on a monthly-ish basis, so if you have any suggestions for next month's topic, definitely let me know. I've also started a Substack for random writing projects, so that's linked below along with my Letterboxd. Anyways, that's everything, so like and subscribe as well. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for watching. Okay, bye.